On Sunday, January 13th, 2008, Rhonda Smith sat in the back pew of the historic Trinity Lutheran Church in tiny Springfield Township, Pennsylvania, doing her best to try to stay calm. The 42-year-old choir singer knew that her pastor, Greg Shreves, would soon call her up to the pulpit to speak, so she was keeping a close eye on him, waiting for his signal. The winter sun streamed in through the stained glass windows of the 18th century sanctuary, and the rays caught the minister's beautiful pale blue eyes. And when this happened, Rhonda noticed, and right away she couldn't help but think to herself how unbelievably handsome the minister really was. At age 56, Shreves was an unlikely minister. He had spent decades as a country club golf pro and official on the professional golf tour before answering God's call in 2005. Shreves was more than 6 feet tall and very fit, and he had blonde hair that was still visible amongst his grays. And he was single. Now, Rhonda was not romantically involved with her minister. To her mind, it was just more of an intimate friendship. But she was deeply touched by everything the minister had done for her. On this particular Sunday, as Rhonda sat nervously in the pew, Pastor Shreves announced that a fundraising campaign he had launched to help Rhonda with her expenses had brought in $3,000. Then Pastor Shreves gave the signal to Rhonda for her to come up and say a few words. And so when Rhonda stood up and began walking towards the pulpit, the 100 or so people in the pews immediately began to applaud and cheer as she walked towards the front. By the time Rhonda was standing at the pulpit next to Pastor Shreves, she was totally embarrassed, but also very touched. Rhonda had actually asked Pastor Shreves for this opportunity to thank the whole congregation, but now that she was actually up there, she was shaking with anxiety. She looked over at Pastor Shreves, who nodded warmly to her, as if to say, "You can do this." So Rhonda took a deep breath, and then she began to speak. She would tell the members of the church that in the 2 years since she had been attending Trinity Lutheran, she had felt welcomed with open arms. This really felt like her home. Rhonda's voice broke as she admitted to the struggles in her life, struggles that many in the congregation already knew about. Rhonda was unable to work full-time because of her battles with mental illness, which had driven her at times to thoughts of suicide. She had been in danger of being evicted from her apartment because she couldn't afford her bills when Pastor Shreves stepped in and began raising money for her. Rhonda tearfully said she owed a debt of gratitude to everyone in the sanctuary as she looked out at all the beaming faces. Out in the crowd was Judy Zellner, a 60-year-old grandmother who was Rhonda's best friend at church. Judy had actually introduced herself to Rhonda on the very first day that Rhonda had shown up at Trinity. And in no time, they were having lunches together like old pals. There was also Mary Jane Fonder, who was also out in the pews, and she was a singer in the choir with Rhonda. Mary Jane was 65 years old and very eccentric. She often wore a wig, sometimes backwards, but she was so kind. One time, when Rhonda was not feeling very well, Mary Jane had baked her a blueberry pie as a way to cheer her up. And of course, there was Pastor Shreves standing right next to Rhonda, who had taken Rhonda under his wing and even offered her temporary work in the church office. Rhonda had never met a man that was so caring and loving. To close out her speech, Rhonda, again very tearfully, told the congregation how thankful she was, and she also said, I don't know what would have happened to me without all of your love and support, so thank you. And then after that, the room broke into applause again. As Rhonda stepped down from the pulpit, Pastor Shreves made a show of smiling really wide and winking right at Rhonda, really letting her know how special she was. And as she walked back to her pew, feeling very special, she couldn't help but wonder if any of the other women in the congregation felt just a little jealous because of her obvious close relationship to Pastor Shreves, someone that all the women really seemed to like in this church. But just then, Rhonda noticed someone unfamiliar sitting in her row. The man had a gray beard, messy hair, and he wore glasses. His clothes looked rumpled, and Rhonda noticed that he was actually the only person in the entire church who was not clapping for her. The following Sunday, Rhonda did not go to church. Instead, she was sobbing uncontrollably on the phone with a mental health counselor, saying that she was a failure and couldn't drag herself out of bed. Social workers were so worried about her that they visited Rhonda's apartment just to make sure she didn't hurt herself. When they got there, they found Rhonda in her pajamas, looking like she hadn't slept for days. The social workers really wanted her to sign up for an inpatient treatment program, but Rhonda said absolutely not. She was supposed to start work as a temporary secretary for the church on Monday, and she was not about to miss that, even if it meant giving up going into this treatment program. She had made a promise to Pastor Shreves that she would do this job, and she was not about to let him down. Rhonda knew that she was repeating a familiar pattern. Just when something good was right within reach, she would have a mental breakdown that kind of ruined it. She had always dreamed of being a teacher, but these bouts of depression and anorexia had kind of doomed her ambitions. Now she was unemployed in her 40s, and her romantic life was not much better. Rhonda was a smart and attractive person, but her relationships always fell apart. At one point, she had poured her heart out to Pastor Shreves about her history of bad boyfriends. And when she did, he put his arm around her and he reminded her that it only takes one good person. Pastor Shreves called that Sunday night to check in on Rhonda after she didn't come to church. He wanted to make sure Rhonda was okay, but he also wanted to make sure that she'd be able to work the next day. The pastor was going to be away at a conference, and so he needed someone there at the church to answer the phones. And Rhonda promised him she would be there bright and early. By Wednesday morning, so 3 days into her temporary job, Rhonda had learned the routine of her new job, but it was making her lonely. From 9 to 5 every day, Rhonda was supposed to sit in this little plain office inside of the church and just wait for the phone to ring. With Pastor Shreves gone, she was the only person in the church, so she had no one to talk to while she worked and way too much time to think about her own problems. But on this Wednesday, she did her best to cheer herself up by reminding herself that she had a date that day after work. He was a nice man that she'd met in a bipolar disorder support group, so maybe he would understand the ups and downs of her life. But right now, the end of the day when that date was going to start seemed really far off to Rhonda. Rhonda wished someone, anyone, would call just to break up the monotony of the day. Even if that call came from the very eccentric, backwards wig-wearing Mary Jane Fonder, who often called the church and seemed totally confused. In fact, Mary Jane had called the church on Rhonda's first day of work on Monday, and when Mary Jane realized that Rhonda was filling in for the receptionist, Mary Jane promptly wished Rhonda a belated happy birthday. It was not Rhonda's birthday, but she said that she appreciated Mary Jane's thoughtfulness. But then Mary Jane began asking Rhonda, "Well, why didn't you invite me to your birthday party?" Rhonda had said there was no party, but Mary Jane just did not believe her. Rhonda had finally made an excuse to get off the phone. But now, 2 days later, sitting in this room feeling so bored, left with these horrible thoughts in her head, Rhonda kind of wished Mary Jane would call. At least it was something to do. Rhonda had talked to mental health counselors 4 times in the past week as she felt herself slipping into the blackness of depression. Her parents were really worried about her. Her dad called her every morning just to hear Rhonda reassure him that she was up and at 'em. Rhonda wished that she really felt that way. At 10:55 a.m. that day, the metallic clunk of the church's side door opening broke the silence. Rhonda thought it might be Pastor Shreves, back from his conference earlier than expected, and for a moment, she was really excited. Rhonda swiveled around her chair, getting ready to greet the minister, but to her surprise, it was not Pastor Shreves. It was somebody else, and she couldn't really understand why they were there. But what surprised Rhonda even more was what this person was carrying in their hand. Two hours later, at 1 p.m., Judy Zellner, who was Rhonda's best friend at church, parked outside of Trinity Church and stepped out of her van into the crisp winter air. Judy had long ago lost her tolerance for cold days like this, and so she made a beeline for the church building. Judy fumbled for her keys, eager to get inside of the warm building. She glanced into the ground floor window of the church offices, but didn't see anybody inside. Judy was the sexton of this church, which, she would joke, was a fancy way of saying she was the cleaning lady. And on this day, that was why she was at the church, to clean it. When Judy finally found the right key and put it inside the lock, she was surprised to find the side door of the church was actually already unlocked. Springfield Township was a community of only 5,000 people with very little crime, but the policy was, on weekdays, the church doors were supposed to be locked. But regardless, Judy stepped through the door and began to peel off her coat, and as she did, she looked up and noticed the door that led into the office where Rhonda was working was open. Judy walked over and stuck her head in the door and called out hello, but nobody called back. So Judy opened the door the rest of the way and she looked into the office, but there was no one sitting behind the desk, there was nobody inside the office, and she was about to leave and go walk around the church to find where this mystery person was who had unlocked the side door, when Judy spotted something just on the side of the desk inside of this office. It was somebody's foot. Judy at first didn't even know what to do, but then instinct took over and she rushed around the desk and she looked down and she could not believe what she was seeing. There was a woman laying face down in a pool of blood that had totally saturated the carpet beneath her. The woman's long brown hair was all matted red, and the side of her face that Judy could see was totally destroyed. It was like a shattered mess of flesh and bone. But whoever this woman was, she was still breathing. Judy could see her chest rising and falling. Judy wanted to roll this person over and try to perform CPR, but she could tell the woman's injuries were just too severe for her to help. Then it dawned on Judy, whoever hurt this person could still be inside the church. And so Judy snatched the church's cordless phone off its cradle and ran outside without her coat. Standing in the parking lot, freezing cold and shaking with fear, Judy dialed 911. When the dispatcher answered, Judy blurted out that somebody was attacked inside of her church. Paramedics and a state trooper arrived a few minutes later, and Judy showed them to the church office where she had found the woman on the ground. And when the paramedics went in there, the woman on the ground was still alive. And so the paramedics asked Judy to leave the office while they attended to this woman, and so Judy nodded and went back outside again, but then looped around to the side of the building and looked into the office through the window. And when she did, she saw the paramedics lift the woman off the ground and roll her over onto a backboard to take her out to the ambulance. And it was at this point that Judy finally got a look at this woman, and the woman who had been hurt was her dear friend, Rhonda. "17 miles away, Pennsylvania State Trooper Greg Stumpo was eating lunch at his favorite Italian restaurant when he got a call from dispatch. A woman had been apparently shot inside of the Trinity Lutheran Church, and she was barely clinging to life, and so could Stumpo report to the scene. Since Stumpo was the senior officer on his three-man detective team, Stumpo knew he would lead any investigation. Stumpo wolfed down the rest of his chicken parmesan and then hit the road for the church. Even though he had been a detective in rural Bucks County, Pennsylvania for almost a decade now, Stumpo really had never gotten to investigate many murders. Springfield Township itself had seen only 2 murders in the entire last 2 decades, and so Stumpo felt a big rush of adrenaline as he drove. By the time Stumpo arrived, the church was already crawling with police looking for physical evidence from the shooting. So Stumpo walked up to one of the other troopers and asked where he could find the woman who made the 911 call, Judy. The trooper immediately turned and pointed out to an idling van out in the parking lot. So Stumpo walked over and he knocked on Judy's window, which totally startled Judy. Judy had been sitting in her vehicle with the windows up, heat blasting, staring straight ahead, so shocked she couldn't even muster any tears. But she turned and looked over at Stumpo, and in his suit and tie, he did not look like a state trooper, and he very likely could tell that's what she was thinking, and so he reached down and picked up his badge and flashed it to her to show her who he was. At that point, Judy lowered down her window, but stayed in her van as she described for Stumpo what happened when she walked inside of the church. She would tell Stumpo that when she first walked into the office, the woman on the floor was so bloody and mangled that Judy didn't recognize that it was her good friend Rhonda. And Judy said at first she was positive this woman on the ground was dead, but then she realized her chest was rising and falling, and so she was still alive. Judy couldn't understand why anybody would want to hurt her friend Rhonda. Judy described Rhonda as being very sweet and shy, with kind eyes and a warm smile. She said the two of them had hit it off immediately when they first met, and they had become very close friends, despite the 20-year age difference between them. But Judy also told Stumpo that Rhonda had a dark side too. She struggled with bouts of depression that at times left her totally unable to function, and one time Rhonda had been so suicidal that she had to be hospitalized 5 years earlier. And Judy said, lately it seemed like Rhonda was slipping back into a depression. Stumpo was expressionless as he listened to Judy, But inside, based on what she was saying, he was beginning to wonder if maybe this was an attempted suicide rather than an attempted murder. But there was an immediate complication to that theory. Police had not recovered a weapon. If Rhonda shot herself, shouldn't the gun be right there at the scene? Maybe even still in her hand? After speaking with Judy, Stumpo went back inside the church and over to the church office where Rhonda had been found. And when he went in there, he noticed there was now a black tape outline of where Rhonda's body had been, and it was on this part of the rug that was now totally covered in blood. Stumpo got down on his hands and knees to see if maybe there was a gun under the desk or some of the other furniture nearby, but there was nothing. And then an idea occurred to Stumpo. Did someone help Rhonda shoot herself, perhaps disposing of the weapon for her afterwards? He went back outside to Judy's van and asked directly if she removed a gun from the office. Judy was totally offended at the very idea. She'd been careful not to disturb anything. But while Stumpo was inside, Judy said she had thought of someone that police might want to speak with. Judy said she recalled a very unkempt-looking stranger who had come to their church earlier in January when Rhonda had stood up before the congregation, and that was the first time that Judy had ever seen this guy. Judy said that on that day, as the donation plate was passed around, she overheard the stranger say something about how this church would be a good place to rob. Judy had not taken this comment seriously, but now she wondered, did this man shoot Rhonda while he was attempting to rob the church? Stumpo took down Judy's description of this man and figured it was possible that the stranger had come back to the church to rob it. Maybe Rhonda was just in the wrong place at the wrong time. As Stumpo headed to his car, he asked one of the troopers to make sure they spoke to the minister and see if he could figure out if anything valuable was missing from the church. After that, Stumpo drove to St. Luke's Hospital, where paramedics had taken Rhonda. Once he was there, he found Rhonda in a private room, heavily bandaged and unconscious. Her forlorn-looking parents stood vigil at her bedside. The doctor told Stumpo before he entered that Rhonda was being kept alive by machines, and it was very unlikely that she would survive after so much brain damage and loss of blood. Rhonda's parents, Jim and Dorothy Smith, who were both in their 70s, agreed to step outside to a waiting area with Stumpo where they could all chat. Stumpo brought them coffee in styrofoam cups, and he sat down and started by saying how very sorry he was about what had happened. Then Rhonda's father, Jim, told Stumpo about Rhonda's long struggle with bipolar disorder and the many times their daughter had flirted with suicide. Jim said he would never let Rhonda keep a gun around her apartment, and he would never keep one at his own house. Luckily, Jim added, the one time Rhonda had tried shooting a gun, she had hated it. And so Jim told Stumpo that he thought it was very unlikely that Rhonda would ever shoot herself. Jim told Stumpo that he and his wife Dorothy had not actually seen their daughter earlier that day. However, they had spoken to her around 8:30 a.m., and she sounded like she was in a good mood. Then again, Jim said, because of Rhonda's condition, her moods could sometimes change on a dime. 4 hours after that conversation, so at about 12:30 p.m., Jim and Dorothy had driven past the church on their way to lunch, and they saw Rhonda's car in the parking lot. The parents talked about stopping by and taking their daughter out for a bite, but they figured Rhonda was busy. Employment had been scarce for Rhonda, so they continued past the church and wound up eating lunch without her. The detective listened carefully and very sympathetically, but internally, he didn't get the feeling that these parents were going to actually offer up any information that could actually help investigators. But at the end of the conversation, Jim said something somewhat off the cuff to Stumpo that made Stumpo pause. Jim said that he prayed his daughter had not tried to kill herself. He and his wife were very religious, and they believed anybody who even attempted suicide faced eternal damnation, and so they couldn't bear such a fate for their beloved child. As the parents got up to leave, Jim told Stumpo that he really hoped investigators would not find a gun at the church. Jim's parting remark left Stumpo wondering whether they were telling the truth when they said they did not stop at the church on the way to lunch. Maybe, he thought, they walked into the church only to find their daughter lying on the floor from a self-inflicted gunshot wound. The parents could have mistakenly believed their daughter was already dead, and maybe they took the weapon from the scene so it didn't look like a suicide. Stumpo knew this idea was a total long shot, but it was too early to rule out anything. Just as Stumpo was about to walk out the front door of the hospital, he spotted a tall, middle-aged man with a priest collar in the hospital lobby. The man dabbed at his eyes and composed himself before pressing the elevator button. Stumpo walked over to him and asked the man if he was Pastor Shreves from Trinity Lutheran. Shreves nodded and said he was on his way up to minister to Rhonda's family. Stumpo asked him if he wouldn't mind speaking to him for a couple of minutes, and Pastor Shreves agreed. Shreves was so anxious to get up to Rhonda's bedside that he could barely sit still while the two men talked. Shreves said, he blamed himself for what happened because he had not been at the church to protect Rhonda. The pastor admitted that he really didn't know what he was going to say to Rhonda's parents when he got up there, or what he was going to say to the congregation. Despite his age, Shreves had only just graduated from the seminary 3 years earlier. Before that, he was competing in golf tournaments, and so nothing in his limited experience as a minister had prepared him for something like this. The pastor also said he didn't know Rhonda all that well, and he couldn't remember when she actually first joined the congregation. He described her as a very quiet, lonely young woman who had struggled with mental health issues. Stumpo sized up the minister as he spoke. The man was very handsome, as Judy had mentioned to Stumpo, but what really stood out to Stumpo was not this guy's good looks, but the fact that he did not see Rhonda as a close friend. He actually said, he was not that close with her. Judy had told Stumpo that Rhonda saw the pastor as a very dear friend and mentor. And so to Stumpo, it seemed very clear that Rhonda and Pastor Shreves' relationship was very imbalanced. However, Pastor Shreves did know enough about Rhonda to suggest to Stumpo that he really should look into Rhonda's troubled love life. Shreves said that Rhonda had told him at one point that she had been in a very abusive relationship a few years ago, and things had actually gotten so bad that Rhonda sought the help of a domestic abuse center. Shreves said he didn't know who this ex-boyfriend was, but it was clear to him that their relationship still weighed on Rhonda years after they parted ways. Pastor Shreves told Stumpo that Rhonda also had a more recent breakup with a man she had met online who lived in Philadelphia. Shreves said that as far as he knew, Rhonda and this guy had gone on a few dates, but then at some point the guy had stopped returning Rhonda's calls, and that had left Rhonda feeling very sad and very wounded. Shortly after this, Stumpo and Shreves wrapped up their conversation, and Stumpo headed out the door. And as Stumpo left the hospital, his head was spinning. He had only been investigating the shooting of Rhonda Smith for a few hours, but he already had an array of theories. Did she shoot herself? Was she caught up in an armed robbery? Was she a victim of an abusive former boyfriend? He couldn't prove or disprove any of these. 2 hours later, around 6 p.m., Stumpo got a phone call from another detective, and they told him that Rhonda Smith was dead. Her parents had asked the doctors to take her off life support when it became clear she had absolutely no brain activity. And so the case now was no longer an attempted suicide or murder, it simply was a suicide or a murder. Rhonda was supposed to go on a date on the night that she died, and so Stumpo wasted no time figuring that out and then tracking the date down. The man's name was Gregory Danisavage, and Stumpo found him at his house just before 8 p.m., and he was still dressed in slacks and a blazer for his date that would never happen. Gregory said he was supposed to pick up Rhonda at her apartment at 6 p.m., but she didn't show, and she didn't send him a message to explain. And so he had sat outside in his car for a while, and then finally just went home, hoping that nothing had happened to her. Unfortunately, Stumpo said, something had happened to her, but he wouldn't provide any details. Stumpo asked where Gregory had been late on Wednesday morning, and he had a ready answer. He said he was taking care of his mother as she recovered from surgery. Now seeming a bit nervous, Gregory told Stumpo that the last guy Rhonda had been dating might have wanted to harm her. And so he said, Rhonda feared that that guy was just using her for sex, and so she had tried to slow the relationship down. But when she did that, the guy basically stopped calling her, at which point Rhonda began calling him, but he never picked up. Stumpo thanked Gregory for the tip, and then he left. However, when Stumpo followed up on Gregory's tip about this previous guy who Rhonda had been seeing, who apparently was just using her for sex, well, Stumpo quickly determined that it was a total dead end. The guy's name was Ray Finkel, and he would tell Stumpo that he had only gone on 4 dates with Rhonda, and he had stopped calling her really just because her house was too far away. Finkel said he was working all day Wednesday, the day that Rhonda was killed, and he had the security card check-in to prove it. As Stumpo ended the call with Ray Finkel, He was thinking that neither Gregory nor Ray even knew Rhonda well enough to want her dead. These were not exactly torrid love affairs. However, the abusive ex-boyfriend that Pastor Shreves had warned about turned out to be a much darker story. A social worker at the domestic abuse center that Rhonda had called said that Rhonda had accused this man of sexually assaulting her 4 years ago and getting her pregnant. Rhonda eventually got an abortion, but the social worker said that Rhonda was haunted by the experience. Then the social worker said that as part of Rhonda's therapy, she kept a journal of her relationship with her abuser. And so the social worker told Stumpo that maybe that journal would give investigators the information that they needed. Rhonda's parents gave Stumpo the spare key to their daughter's apartment. And then when Stumpo went into the apartment, inside of a desk drawer, he found all these yellow legal pads that were filled with Rhonda's writing. And the writing included all the intimate details of her past relationship with this man who had hurt her so badly. They painted a picture of a very unhappy romance, one that continued even after she accused this man of abuse. But Rhonda indicated in her more recent entries that she had not had any contact with this guy for 2 whole years. And so this abusive boyfriend really seemed like a bad person, but he didn't really fit the profile of Rhonda's murderer because he had not interacted with her in years. And so Stumpo now understood why people said Rhonda was unlucky in love, but so far, nothing in her past seemed to add up to a motive for murder. While Stumpo tracked down the rest of Rhonda's boyfriends, other members of his team began to look into that strange newcomer to the church, the kind of disheveled-looking guy who Judy had overheard say, Trinity Lutheran would be a good place to rob. Well, despite having a great description of this guy within 24 hours of the shooting, he was about 5'10", he wore wire-rimmed glasses and had scraggly salt and pepper hair. Despite having this description, none of the state databases of criminals and people on parole or probation contained anyone who looked like this stranger. Now, of course, Stumpo didn't just rule him out as a potential suspect simply because he couldn't find him. However, at the same time, the whole robbery idea just seemed kind of unlikely to Stumpo. Pastor Shreves had told Stumpo that the church rarely had any cash inside, and the pastor actually looked all around the church and couldn't find anything missing following the shooting. So if Rhonda really was the victim of a robbery gone bad, then why wasn't anything stolen? And so 2 days into this investigation, and Stumpo had almost nothing to show for all his effort. He wasn't even sure if he was investigating a murder or a suicide. A few days later, on Monday afternoon, January 28th, so 5 days after the murder, Stumpo sat in the balcony of the church as Pastor Shreves led Rhonda's memorial service below. More than 250 people had packed into the church to show their love for Rhonda. Stumpo looked down and saw Rhonda's parents sitting in the front row, and as he did, he considered the possibility that, the parents had covered up their daughter's suicide. It seemed extremely unlikely, but it was still possible. Then Stumpo scanned around the rest of the teary-eyed parishioners and thought to himself, if Rhonda did not kill herself, then the culprit was probably in this room. After the service ended, Stumpo waited for the crowd to thin, then he asked Pastor Shreves if he had a few minutes. Shreves walked Stumpo out of the church and across the parking lot to the small ranch house where he lived. As they reached his porch, Stumpo noticed an apple pie sitting in front of the side door to the house, but Pastor Shreves was not happy about this pie. As soon as he read the note that was sitting on top of the pie, Shreves expressed his irritation. He explained to Stumpo that one of the members of the church would often leave food for him, even though he had asked her to stop. Stumpo asked Shreves who this woman was, and Shreves would say her name was Mary Jane. The same Mary Jane who was very eccentric and wore her wigs backwards, and at one point had actually baked a pie for Rhonda. Shreves would say, Mary Jane was a member of the church's choir, and she was a talented artist whose paintings hung on the walls of the church, but he said, I think she has a crush on me. And as the pastor talked, Stumpo remembered how people at the church said there was like this running joke that, Pastor Shreves was single and handsome, and basically all the women who went to this church had crushes on him, and some of them liked to bring him unsolicited gifts like food. And so Stumpo was pretty sure that Rhonda Smith must be one of these admirers, just like Mary Jane was, And, that was probably why their relationship seemed so imbalanced, with Rhonda looking at the pastor as this mentor and close friend, and the pastor basically being like, yeah, I know Rhonda, she's nice, but that's about it. Over the next few days, the events on the morning of the shooting became increasingly clear as investigators talked to more people and collected records. On the day Rhonda died, she had called a mental health crisis line from the church just after 10 a.m., saying she felt suicidal. Then at 10:55, she stopped using the church internet service, suggesting she was either shot right before then or right after that point. And so in Stumpo's mind, it was easy to imagine a desperate, lonely person making one last call for help before just ending it all. But then, on January 30th, Stumpo received the autopsy report. Sitting at his desk in the police barracks 15 miles from Springfield Township, Stumpo marveled at what he read in the report. It didn't solve the case by any means, but it did make one thing clear. This was no suicide. The medical examiner found that Rhonda had been shot twice. The first bullet glanced off her forehead, while the second round penetrated her skull. What's more, the shots were fired from 3 or 4 feet away, suggesting that the shooter was on the other side of the desk from Rhonda. The coroner said Rhonda's head had none of the tiny burn marks that are associated with shots fired at extremely close range, like a suicide gunshot would be. And so Stumpo concluded that, while Rhonda may have been depressed, she certainly did not pull the trigger to end her own life. She was definitely murdered. About a week later, on the evening of February 6th, Stumpo and another investigator named Bob Egan arrived at Trinity Lutheran Church just before 7 p.m. when choir practice was about to begin. One of the few members of the church community they had not spoken with yet was Mary Jane Fonder, though they had heard a lot about her. Mostly that she was very eccentric, wore her wig backwards sometimes, and periodically dropped off pies for the pastor and for Rhonda. And so Stumpo and the other investigator walked into the church, and right away they spotted Mary Jane, along with the other members of the choir, getting ready to start their practice, and the investigators flagged Mary Jane and asked her to come with them so they could talk to her in a side room. But as they were walking over to this room, Mary Jane said to them that she had actually been meaning to reach out to them because she had spoken to Rhonda a couple of days before she was killed. Mary Jane said she had called into the church and was surprised when Rhonda answered and not the normal secretary. But Mary Jane said she had actually just taken the time to talk to Rhonda because Mary Jane had been worried about Rhonda's state of mind, like many other people in the church were. And so Mary Jane told the investigators that Rhonda apparently had such a crush on Pastor Shreves that, at least to Mary Jane, it seemed like it was clouding her judgment. And the example that Mary Jane gave to show this was she said the minister had organized a birthday party for Rhonda just before her death, and Rhonda had not invited Mary Jane to attend, even though in Mary Jane's eyes, they were close friends. And so it just seemed like Rhonda was being weirdly protective of Pastor Shreves and didn't want other women there. Mary Jane would also tell the investigators that she was just too upset to even attend Rhonda's memorial service, but she had baked a pie for Rhonda's parents and visited with them after the service. Then Detective Egan asked Mary Jane point blank, did she own a gun? And Mary Jane kind of laughed and said no, and she wouldn't even know how to use one. So the detectives thanked Mary Jane for her time, and then she turned and headed back over to choir practice, and the detectives walked out of the church feeling like they were no closer to solving this crime. But having now met Mary Jane, she seemed less like this totally eccentric, weird person that people had made her out to be, and more just like a very harmless old lady. The following day, February 7th, Stumpo learned that the state police were reassigning the other 2 detectives in his unit to other cases that weren't even murders. Stumpo knew what that meant. His bosses were losing confidence in his investigation because he was not making enough progress. And so now the Rhonda murder investigation was down to just him and Detective Egan, who was on loan from headquarters. And as weeks passed by, still with no breakthrough, Stumpo began to worry that they might never solve this crime. But Detective Egan, who was a veteran homicide investigator, kept saying that you never know when a hot tip will come in the door. And that's exactly what happened on a cold and windy morning on Saturday, March 29th, nearly 9 weeks after Rhonda's murder. 6 miles from Trinity Lutheran Church, A man and his 8-year-old son were fishing in Lake Nakamixin under the bridge that runs across it. At some point, the boy noticed something shiny in the muddy, shallow water at the lake's edge. He pulled what looked like a toy gun out of the water and showed off his trophy to his dad. But when the boy's father took a look, he realized his son was not holding a toy, it was a real gun. The father snatched the revolver from the boy's hands and immediately popped open the cylinder and shook the weapon to make sure it was not loaded. 3 live rounds fell into the mud, plus the casing from a bullet which had already been fired. The boy's father called the state police barracks where Stumpo worked to report that his son had found a loaded gun in the lake, and the man wondered what he should do with it. The trooper who answered this phone call, whose name was Andrew Mincer, had been the first police officer on the scene at the Rhonda Smith shooting, and he immediately thought of the missing weapon from that crime. Mincer asked the father for the serial number on the gun, and after he got it, he told the father to hang onto the gun and give it to nobody else until he, Mincer, could get there to pick it up. As soon as Mincer hung up the phone, he ran the serial number through the National Crime Information Center, and in minutes, he learned who the Rossi .38 revolver was registered to. Stumpo was in the police barracks when this call came in, but he was down in the locker room thinking about how little time he had spent with his 5-year-old son lately. Police work was literally taking over Stumpo's life, and he had so little to show for it. Stumpo was about to head home when his cell phone rang. The call was coming from within the station he was standing in, and so Stumpo sighed at the thought of even more police work to do. But the instant Stumpo answered, Mincer, who was very excited, told him that a little boy who had been fishing out in Lake Nakamixin had just found a .38 caliber revolver just like the one that had been fired at Rhonda Smith. Mincer said the gun was purchased in 1994, 14 years before Rhonda's murder. But despite being a bit old and having been in the water, it still appeared to be in working condition. And so Stumpo suddenly felt totally energized, and he couldn't help but think, this sounds like we have just found the murder weapon. The next day was a Sunday, but the ballistics expert at the state trooper barracks happened to be in the crime lab that day, working on another case. Stumpo convinced him to drop what he was doing and test the gun the boy found in the lake against the slug that the coroner pulled from Rhonda. And the test proved the revolver found in the lake was the one that killed Rhonda. The next day, Detectives Stumpo and Egan visited the address associated with the original owner of the gun. And the property they went to was this rundown cabin at the end of a long driveway sitting on 11 acres of woods. Stumpo and Egan knew that this address was probably an important break in the case, but it didn't mean the original owner of this gun was definitely Rhonda's killer. It had been 14 years since this revolver was purchased, so plenty of time for the gun to change hands may be off the books. After Stumpo knocked, an old man wearing a dress shirt and a plastic pocket protector opened the door just a crack and peered out very suspiciously at the detectives. Egan asked if it would be okay if they came inside and spoke to him, and the man very reluctantly opened the door the rest of the way and stepped aside to let them come in. Stumpo and Egan were appalled by what they saw inside. The house was a hoarder's den. Junk-filled boxes and papers piled high and covered with cobwebs and bird droppings. The entire place just totally reeked, to the point where both detectives were breathing through their mouths just so they didn't have to smell the air. Now, the police knew this man was not the original owner of the gun. It was actually his sister who lived with him. And so the detectives asked him if his sister was home, but the man said she wasn't. So the detectives asked him if he knew that his sister had at one point purchased a .38 revolver. The man said that his sister had trouble with a coworker several years back and felt kind of threatened, so she had bought a gun. But she only shot it once in the yard for practice, and the noise was apparently too much for her. Her brother said that she had thrown the gun away years ago, and he didn't know where she threw it away, and he had never seen it or heard about it again. But Stumpo and Egan were not fully convinced about this story. They told the brother that the gun had just been pulled out of the lake. If the gun had been tossed into the water in 1994, shortly after his sister bought it, then by now it would be totally covered in rust. But the gun had no rust on it, which indicated it had not been in the lake for more than a few weeks. The brother fell quiet for a moment, and then told the investigators that he did have something to show them. He took them outside to his car, and he lifted the driver's floor mat to reveal something which shocked the two investigators, and it confirmed that they were on the right track. The old man showed the detectives shiny pieces of metal that were underneath the floor mat of his car, and the detectives immediately recognized these fragments as being part of a bullet casing. Now, when that boy had found the gun in the lake, it had contained 3 live rounds and 1 spent shell casing. However, investigators knew that Rhonda had been shot twice, so there needed to be 2 spent shell casings. And so far, all they could account for was that one that the boy found in the gun. And now, these fragments on the floor of the car could be, potentially, pieces of that other spent round. At last, Stumpo finally had his primary suspect. It was this old man's sister, the original owner of this gun. And that afternoon, police were able to arrest her right as she left the Trinity Lutheran Church, driving her brother's car. The same car that police had just found those fragments from the shell casing underneath the floor mat. Also, after they made this arrest, police searched the inside of the car, and they found a calendar with January 23rd circled, the day Rhonda was murdered, and over that date on the calendar were the words, "Rhonda murdered." Based on Stumpo and Egan's investigation, here is what really happened on January 23rd, the day Rhonda was murdered. At 10:30 a.m. on January 23rd, the killer slipped into her brother's car and drove to Trinity Lutheran Church. She pulled into the parking lot, and as she did, she looked over at the first-floor office window, and she saw Rhonda sitting inside. The killer got out of the car, walked up to the side door of the church, they unlocked it, and went inside. Once inside, the killer looked around the building and determined that Rhonda was the only person inside. The killer then walked over to the church office where Rhonda was. She went inside, and as soon as she did, Rhonda's face lit up with recognition and a smile, until Rhonda noticed the revolver in the killer's hand. Seconds later, the killer raised the gun, aimed it at Rhonda, and fired. The shot struck Rhonda right in the forehead, knocking her off her chair and onto the floor. The killer rushed around the desk and stood over Rhonda, and right away they noticed the bullet had only grazed Rhonda's forehead. And so with Rhonda writhing in pain on the carpet, the killer backed up a couple of feet and then raised their gun again, aimed it at the side of Rhonda's head, and fired. And this time, the bullet went right into Rhonda's head. Satisfied that Rhonda was now dead, the killer casually left the church and drove to a hair appointment. After the detectives questioned her in connection with the murder, the killer got nervous and decided to get rid of the gun. So the killer borrowed her brother's car, drove 6 miles to that bridge that crossed over Lake Nakamixon, and the killer tossed the gun out the window without even stopping. And then, a month later, the boy and his father would find the gun. It would turn out the original owner of the gun and Rhonda's murderer was none other than the eccentric, backwards wig-wearing, apple pie-making Mary Jane Fonder. Mary Jane did not see Rhonda as a desperately lonely, depressed person on the brink of suicide. Instead, she saw Rhonda as this pretty young thing who was competing with her, Mary Jane, for the affection and love of Pastor Shreves. Mary Jane was convinced that Rhonda and the pastor were having this romantic love affair, even though they totally were not. In Mary Jane's mind, she believed that she and Pastor Shreves had this undeniable chemistry, and they were meant to be together. And she was sure he felt the same way, even though he repeatedly asked her to stop calling him and to basically leave him alone. The last straw for Mary Jane had been when the pastor had raised money to help Rhonda out, and then got the whole congregation to clap and applaud for her when she was up there speaking. No one ever helped out Mary Jane when she lost her job and needed money, and Mary Jane had been a member of the church for 14 years. Compared to her, Rhonda was a newcomer. So Mary Jane killed Rhonda out of spite and jealousy, and with the hope that once Rhonda was out of the way, Mary Jane would have the pastor all to herself. All of this was obviously delusional, but Mary Jane believed it. And it would turn out this wasn't the first time Mary Jane was connected to a suspicious death. Back in 1993, her 83-year-old father disappeared. Mary Jane, who was his caretaker, claimed that he walked out of the house and never came home. Now, at the time, police did suspect that Mary Jane had killed her father and either completely destroyed his body or managed to hide it really well. And Mary Jane, she remained under suspicion for this death, but police could never prove it. In the end, Mary Jane would be convicted of murdering Rhonda, and she would be sentenced to life in prison. However, she would die in prison only 10 years into her sentence. Brittany Norwood was born in 1982 in Federal Way, Washington, which is a small city located about 20 miles south of Seattle. Growing up, Brittany's family never had much money. Her father, who was the primary breadwinner, ran a small upholstery shop in town, and while he worked tirelessly, he barely earned enough money to make ends meet. And considering how large Brittany's family was, she was one of 9 siblings, the lack of financial resources at times made life very challenging. However, Brittany's parents were not complainers, and they instilled in all of their children the importance of hard work regardless of circumstance. And clearly that message resonated with their children because by the time Brittany was a teenager, her older siblings had already gone on to become doctors, engineers, and management consultants. As for Brittany, she was just as ambitious as her older siblings, but her interests were in athletics. By the time she was in high school, she had become one of the very best soccer players in the entire state of Washington. She was so good, in fact, that by her senior year of high school in 2000, the best college soccer programs in America were actively recruiting her. She would finally settle on attending Stony Brook University in Long Island, New York, because they offered her a fantastic scholarship and they were known for their excellent soccer program. Brittany was incredibly proud of her scholarship. It not only represented the hard work pays off motto that her parents had preached all of her life, but it also lifted a serious financial burden off of her parents. So in the fall of 2000, Brittany left Washington State and headed east to New York to begin her collegiate career. But right away, she struggled. Brittany had never left home before, and now she was suddenly 3,000 miles away from her family and her friends, and she missed them terribly. Within the first few days of being at her new school, she called her family and told them how much she missed them and how she kind of regretted coming to New York in the first place, but they reassured her that she had made the right choice, that these feelings were normal, and she just needed to give it some time. But despite taking her family's advice and sticking it out at Stony Brook, Brittany never really felt like she belonged there. She made friends, she got good grades, and performed well on the soccer team, but with every passing semester, Brittany became less and less connected to the school and the people there and just longed to be home. And so with that in mind, in 2003, so 3 years after she had arrived at Stony Brook, Brittany was at her school feeling down about her situation when she had a serious lapse in judgment. Brittany, who had never gotten in trouble in her life before, randomly stole one of her teammates' things out of their locker. She didn't even know why she did it. It just kind of happened, and then pretty much immediately she got caught. And as soon as she returned what she had taken. She felt horrible and she apologized, but the damage was done. The incident had already been reported to the school, and the school had a very strict code of conduct policy, which theft was in clear violation of. And so Brittany had her scholarship revoked, and without it, her family could no longer afford the school, and so she had to come back home. And when she got home, she felt like she had let her entire family down. And so for the next several years, the shadow of this huge mistake loomed over her like a dark cloud. She just kind of kept her head down and took part-time work here and there, but for the most part, while she was home, she was just sad and directionless. But finally, in 2010, so 7 years after coming home from school, when Brittany was now 28 years old, she decided enough was enough. She was going to stop letting this mistake define her life. She was going to go out and find a career and make something of her life, like her other siblings had. And the career move that seemed to make the most sense to her was becoming a personal trainer. Despite not playing soccer anymore, fitness was still a very big part of her life, and she loved the idea of helping other people get fit and stay fit. And so she began looking at where personal trainers were the most in demand, and she found Washington, D.C. was a total hotspot, and it just so happened 2 of her siblings were already living there. And so that year, she packed up her stuff and she headed out to DC as well. When she got there, she had a little cash, but not enough to sustain her longer than a month or two, so she applied for and got a job with a Lululemon shop. Lululemon is a company that sells yoga athletic apparel. The shop was located in Bethesda, which is a very wealthy suburb of Washington, D.C., and right around the corner from the shop was a gym that Brittany immediately fell in love with and decided would be the perfect gym for her to run her personal training practice out of once she got certified. So a very happy and rejuvenated Brittany began work at the Lululemon shop in Bethesda in late 2010, fully expecting to only be there for a few months before she transitioned to her personal training career. At around the same time Brittany began working at the store, another young woman had started working there as well. Her name was Jana Murray, and she was quite similar to Brittany. She was 30, so 2 years older than Brittany, and she had been raised in a close-knit, modest household in Texas where her parents had preached always working hard and doing the right thing, and she really took that to heart. And like Brittany, Jana was also a star high school athlete, except instead of playing soccer, she was a big track and field star. And actually, she set some records in Texas for the discus throw. But after graduating high school, instead of pursuing athletics in college, Jana had pursued business. She enrolled in the business program at George Washington University in Washington, D.C. After she graduated, she worked in the private sector for a few years before deciding it made sense for her to go back to school to earn her master's degree in business. She was accepted to the very prestigious Johns Hopkins Business School, which was located a few miles from the Lululemon shop where Brittany worked. And by 2010, Jana was in her final semester, and all she had left to complete was a final thesis paper. A thesis is a long essay involving personal research. The assignment was to write about the structure of a company of her choosing. And since Jana was a huge fan of Lululemon apparel, she had decided to write about them. And during her research on Lululemon, she discovered that the company was far more than just clothing. They had what seemed to be a really cool company culture. All employees, no matter how junior, were encouraged to pursue whatever goals they had, even if their goals meant leaving Lululemon at some point. It was like the company fundamentally cared more about their people than their product. And Jana loved that. And so as she's writing this paper, on a whim, she decides to go get a job at a Lululemon store. And the nearest location was the one near her school. Jana figured working at this shop would only make it easier to finish her thesis, since it would provide her boots-on-the-ground information. Also, she just wanted to see for herself if this company was as amazing as it seemed to be. And so her plan was just to work at this shop until her thesis was done, at which point she'd earn her master's and more than likely she would quit and move on with her life. So in late 2010, when Brittany and Jana found themselves working at the same Lululemon shop in Bethesda, they were aware of each other, but really didn't know each other. Their only interactions were when their shifts happened to overlap, which did not happen very often. But when it did, they were perfectly nice to each other. They would chit-chat, but they were coworkers, not really friends. However, a terrifying event was about to link them together forever. On the evening of March 11th, 2011, Jana and Brittany were working together at the Lululemon. It was an uneventful shift. They chatted, they helped customers, and in between all of that, they would knock out whatever closing duties they were responsible for so that when closing time came, they could leave quickly. And then when it was closing time at 8 p.m., the pair did one last sweep of the store to make sure everything was neat and put away and locked, and then they both grabbed their things and headed out the front door. Once they were outside, Jana turned around and she pulled the keys out of her pocket and she locked the front door. And then Jana hopped in her car and she drove off. And Brittany, she turned and began walking down the sidewalk toward the metro train station. But after only a few minutes of walking, Brittany swung her backpack off of her shoulder right in front of her, and she reached inside to fish around for her wallet because her metro train pass was inside of her wallet. And so she's fishing around her bag, she's still walking towards the train, and she can't find it. And so she comes to a full stop, she unzips her bag completely, and she looks inside, and her wallet is not in there. And as soon as she sees that it's missing, she remembers she left it on the break room table at the Lululemon store. And the only way she could go back and get her wallet was if Jana came back with the keys and unlocked the front door. And so Brittany just stood there for a minute wondering what she should do. She kind of felt bad about calling Jana to drive back and open the store for her, but she really needed her wallet for a whole bunch of reasons. And so finally, she picks up her cell phone and she calls Jana. And when Jana picks up, Brittany says, I'm really sorry, but I left my wallet in the store. Would you mind coming back and just opening the doors for me? I'll run in and I'll get it. Be super quick. And Jana, surprisingly, was totally fine with this. She actually laughed and said, I left my laptop in the break room and I was going to get it tomorrow, but this is an excuse to go back and get it now. And so Jana told Brittany she would be back at the front of the store in just a couple of minutes. And so Brittany thanked her. They hung up the phone. And then Brittany turned and she began running back towards Lululemon. When Brittany arrived at the front of the store, Jana was already there. And Brittany immediately said, "I'm so sorry. Thank you so much for coming back." And Jana said, "Really, it's no big deal." And then Jana pulled her key out and she opened the front door of the store and they stepped inside. The layout of the store was basically just a big square where the front door entered the square right in the middle of it. So you step inside, you're in this kind of main shopping area. It's just this one square. And then all the way at the back, kind of lined up with the front door, behind the cash registers, was this employee-only hallway that went straight back about 7 or 8 feet. And then it reached this T intersection where if you turned left, there would be another hallway that went straight for maybe 10 or 15 feet. And it would come to a dead end at a door, and that door would lead to a bathroom. And then if you were standing in front of that bathroom door and looked left, there would be another door that led into a very small kitchen. And then if you went back to the T intersection and turned right and looked straight ahead, you would see another stretch of hallway that was about 10 or 15 feet long. And it would look exactly like the left hallway, except at the end of the right hallway, there was no door to a bathroom. It was just kind of a dead end. But at the end of the right hallway, if you walked all the way down it and then turned right, you would see there was a door that led into the break room. So the break room and the kitchen were kind of oriented in the same position at either ends of each hallway. And so the two women go inside the store with Brittany in the front. They get inside, Jana flips on the lights, and they walk across that square main shopping area. They go past the cash registers into that employee-only hallway. They go straight down, they turn right, they make their way down the right hallway, and then they open the door to the break room, and they go inside. Brittany very quickly found her wallet. It was on the table. She grabbed it. And so after she had her wallet, she just left the break room and began walking back out towards the main shopping area and the front door. Jana was only a couple of seconds behind her. She grabbed her laptop and then she left the break room. She walked back down the hallway. And as she turned back into the main shopping area, she kind of had her head down. She was fiddling with her laptop and her phone. But even though she wasn't looking up, just looking down, she could tell right in front of her, Brittany had come to a full stop in the middle of the main shopping area. And so as soon as she saw that, she stopped what she was doing and she looked up. And immediately she could see why Brittany had come to a stop. There were now 2 men wearing all black with black ski masks on that were standing between them and the front door. The following morning, the Lululemon employee who was supposed to come in that morning and open the store and work that day, she turns onto the street that the shop is on and she begins walking towards the front door. It's a bright, beautiful, sunny morning. There are lots of people out going about their daily routines. And so this employee, she walks right up to the front door of the Lululemon. She's not really looking into the store. She's kind of got her head down and she fishes in her pocket. She pulls out her key that opens the front door. She slots it into the lock and she turns it to unlock it. And right away, she feels no resistance. The door was already unlocked. And so this really gets her attention and she looks up, but there's a glare on the glass from the sunlight, so she can't see inside. And so she just pulls the key out of the lock and then she pushes open the door and she takes a very tentative step inside. And right away she sees the entire store is destroyed. There are shelves knocked over, there's clothing everywhere. It's a complete mess. And before she can even process what she's seeing, she hears what sounds like moaning coming from the back of the store, basically back in those hallways. And so this employee is terrified, and instead of going in to investigate, she just turns around and leaves the store and immediately calls 911. And as she's on the phone with police, this man who just happened to be walking by at this moment, he saw her and saw how visibly upset she was. And so he just stood next to her and waited for her to get off the phone with the police. And then when she was, he asked her, what's going on? And she would explain that the door was unlocked, the store is a complete disaster, and I heard moaning inside, and I'm too scared to go in. And so the man says, hey, I'm going to go in there and take a look around because I'm worried there could be someone who's hurt who needs our help right now before the police even get here. And so this man walks through the front door of the Lululemon, and right away, as soon as he steps in, he steps on broken glass and he looks up and the store is completely destroyed. Everything's knocked over. And he immediately hears the moaning coming from the back of the store. And so he very carefully starts walking straight ahead through the store, stepping over shelves that have been knocked down and trying hard not to destroy any merchandise that's on the ground. And when he reaches the back of the store, basically the entrance to this employee hallway that goes straight back, he hears the moaning, but he can't really tell which hallway it's coming from. And so he just calls out like, hey, who's back there? Do you need my help? But there was no reaction. And so he begins walking forward and then he stops. He realizes the ground is slick. And so he looks down and he sees there's a very obvious blood trail from where he is standing straight back down this employee hallway. And the blood trail appears to turn right and kind of disappears out of sight down that right hallway. And so the man is terrified. He turns around and he looks towards the front of the store, kind of hoping that maybe the police or the paramedics would get there. But it's just the employee he had spoken to, and she looks terrified. And so the man decides, if there's someone hurt back here, I really need to go see what's wrong. And so very carefully, he begins walking down this initial hallway, following the blood trail. And then he turns right into that right hallway and he looks, and he can't believe what he is seeing. It looks like the entire right stretch of hallway was covered in blood. I mean, the floors, the walls, the ceilings, everything. There is blood everywhere. However, there's no person. It looks like all this blood kind of turns right and goes into the door at the end of the right hallway, the break room. And so this man knows, okay, obviously someone is very badly hurt, and whoever is moaning is almost certainly in that break room. And so he calls out again to see if this person will call back to him, but it's silent. And so he walks down this right hallway that's soaked in blood, and he gets to the end and he turns right and he grabs the handle of the break room door. He turns the handle and he pushes the door open. And at first he couldn't quite open it. There was something blocking the door from opening, but finally he kind of muscles it open enough that he can look inside, and he realizes what was blocking the door. There was a young woman lying face down on the ground, and her legs had been blocking the door. And this woman was Jaina. And this man, who was not medically trained, immediately understood this woman is deceased. The injuries she has sustained are so bad, there is absolutely no way she is alive. And he immediately thought, she also has likely been dead for some time. This does not look like it just happened. And so he's thinking, who's moaning? Where's the moaning coming from? Is there somebody else in this room? And so he pushes and kind of moves her body out of the way and sticks his head into the break room, and he scans around, but there's no one else in there. But as he's looking around, he hears the moaning again, and he realizes it's coming from the other side of the hallway, at the end of the left hallway. And so he shuts the break room door and he walks back up the hallway to the T intersection. And instead of turning and walking into the main shop, he continues down the left hallway. And he goes all the way down until he's standing in front of the door that leads into the bathroom, and to his left is the door that leads to that kitchen. And as he's standing there, he just kind of yells out, hey, whoever's in here, say something, because he doesn't know what door they're in. And he hears the moaning, and it's coming from the door right in front of him, the bathroom door. And so he opens the bathroom door, and immediately he's struck by all the blood all over the bathroom. And lying on her back on the ground is another young woman. It was Brittany. Her hands were zip tied together and attached to a pipe on the side of the room, and she was covered in blood. There were obvious stab wounds and slash marks and bruises all over her. And at first, this man assumed she must be deceased, and there must be a third person in this bathroom who's doing the moaning. But then he was startled when Brittany made this low, guttural moaning sound, almost like the sound of an animal dying. And he realized that was the moaning he was hearing. It was Brittany. At that moment, the police had arrived. They had rushed inside. They grabbed this man and escorted him out. They secured the scene, and then the paramedics came in, and they would confirm that unfortunately Jaina was deceased. And then when they went to Brittany, they found that she was still clinging to life. And so they put her up onto a stretcher and they began wheeling her out. And as she was being brought out of the store, the paramedics began trying to talk to her. And Brittany, amazingly, was able to say a few words. The police, who are also on the scene, they see this and they're concerned that, she might pass away from her injuries before they get to talk to her. And so sensing she was able to talk, they kind of rushed over as she's being loaded into the ambulance out front. And they would say, "Hey, do you remember anything about what happened to you and the other woman who was in there?" And Brittany was able to tell them that the night before there had been these two men who were wearing all black. They had ski masks on, so they didn't know what they looked like. And they had robbed the store, and then they had sexually assaulted both of the women. But Jaina had apparently fought back so fiercely that they had killed her before they left. And so after she tells police this, the ambulance gets shut up and she's taken away to the hospital. And then the police immediately go into the Lululemon store to get the security footage from inside the shop to see if they can get some footage of the attack and see what happened. But unfortunately, the only camera this store had was on the exterior of the back of the building, just kind of looking out at a parking lot. There were no cameras looking in the store or at the front of the store. You have to remember, Bethesda, where the store was located, was considered to be extremely safe, very low crime neighborhood. And so more than likely, that was why this store did not have a security system. And so very frustrated, the police pulled up the only footage they could, which was this exterior camera. And sure enough, the night before, around midnight, the camera picked up two men wearing all black with their hoods up, running away from the store. And so there was really no way to identify who they were. All they could tell was, one was fairly tall. But nonetheless, they pulled the footage and they gave it to the media. And then that day and into the night, the local news played this footage on repeat, asking people in the area to come forward if they know who these two guys are. But by the next day, when the media and the police investigation had turned up nothing on these two guys, the police added a $150,000 reward for any information about who these two guys were. But after 48 hours since the discovery of this crime, still no one had come forward with any meaningful information about who these guys were, and so the police were kind of at a dead end. And so some of the detectives decided to go back to the Lululemon shop to walk the crime scene again to see if maybe something was missed in the initial search. And so the police, they come back to the shop, and it's being guarded 24/7 by police at this point. There's yellow crime scene tape outside blocking people off. And so the detectives arrive, they go underneath the yellow tape, they go past the security, they go inside, and then one of the detectives just walks straight to the back of the store and just kind of stands there near the registers looking around. And as he was looking around, he began looking at all of the bloody footprints that were on the ground. Now, by this point, all of the prints had been accounted for except for one set. There was a men's size 14 shoe print that had been spotted in several locations in the store, and it was just kind of assumed that it belonged to one of the killers. The thing about this print was that the treads of this shoe were fairly unique. They had a distinctive and fairly easy to recognize pattern to them. The police knew about this shoe print, but to be honest, they hadn't given it much thought because they felt like the print only seemed to confirm that a relatively tall man had been involved in this crime. But as this one detective stood in the back of the store and was just kind of looking around, he noticed a bin of shoes on the ground in the store. These shoes were there for shoppers to put them on when they were getting their pants hemmed and fitted to them. These shoes were not for sale. They were just kind of random shoes that were there effectively as props to make sure people's clothes fit properly. And the detective noticed one of the shoes at the top of the pile in this bin appeared to be a large men's shoe. And so purely out of curiosity, he reached down and he flipped the shoe over to look at the treads. And to his shock, they were an exact match to the unique treads on the size 14 bloody print. But the shoes he was holding were clean. There was no blood on them. So the detectives, they kind of all converge on the shoe, and they're thinking to themselves, did the attackers come in barefoot and perpetrate this attack with store shoes on and then afterwards clean them and leave them behind? Or is it just a crazy coincidence that one of the attackers happened to have the exact same style shoe and size as the one in this bin? They had no idea, but they felt like this was significant and they needed to get to the bottom of why this kind of random shoe in the store matched this print. And they thought the only person who might have more information about what the killer's shoes looked like would be Brittany. And so at this point, Brittany was still in very rough shape, but she had stabilized to the point where the police felt comfortable speaking to her. And so they paid her a visit and they asked her if she could remember anything about her attacker's feet, Did they wear shoes? And if so, what color were they? Anything she could remember at this point would be helpful. But Brittany would say, no, I'm sorry, I don't remember their feet at all. But there was something about the way she just very quickly dismissed the shoes that tipped the police off that maybe Brittany could be hiding something. But the police didn't press her because they knew she had just been in this horrific attack, and they also didn't really have a good sense of what her normal behavior looked like. So they just thanked her and they left. They were planning to speak to her again the following day, but she actually got in touch with them first and offered to have a meeting to go over what happened. And from the sound of her voice, it just sounded like she was just eager to help them. And so the police, they sat down with Brittany again, and they began talking about what happened and kind of going over the details. And they asked her again about the shoes. And again, she said she just didn't know. And then at some point in this second discussion they're having, Brittany kind of offhandedly mentioned something that she believes is just a small detail. But that small detail would ultimately be the thing that would lead police to figure out what actually happened on the night Jayna was killed. This is what happened. Back on March 11th, 2011, so the night of the attack, Jayna and Brittany were working in the store. It was a normal shift. Everything was fine. And then at closing time, they did their duties. They walked outside. Jayna locked the front door, and then they said their goodbyes, and they went their separate ways. Jayna drove off in her car, and Brittany began walking to the metro train station. But Brittany realized she had left her wallet in the break room, and so she called Jayna. And Jayna would tell Brittany that it was no big deal because she had left her laptop in the break room. Back at the front of the store, Jayna double parked her car out on the street, and then she and Brittany headed inside the shop. Brittany would lead the way to the break room at the end of the hallway on the right, and after she got her wallet, Brittany would turn around and leave the break room ahead of Jayna to make her way back out to the main shopping area. And so Jayna was only a few seconds behind Brittany. She was just getting her laptop, and then when she had it, she left the break room, she walked down the hallway, and she turned and began walking into the main shopping area as well. And she had her head down. She was just kind of fiddling with her phone and her laptop. But at some point, she realized, even without looking up, that Brittany had come to a full stop in the middle of the shopping area. So Jayna looks up, and there were not two men wearing all black with black ski masks blocking their way to the front door. In fact, there were no men involved in what happened next at all. The two men that had been seen on the security camera in the back of the building were just two cooks who happened to be hustling by the night of the attack and who happened to be wearing all black. It was just a coincidence. But there was someone standing in the store blocking Jayna from leaving. It was Brittany. Brittany was staring at Jayna, and in her hand was a foot-long square metal rod. It was one of the pieces of metal that normally was anchored into the walls of the store to hold up merchandise. Jayna is so caught off guard by this, she has no idea what the issue is. And so she says to Brittany, hey, calm down, we can talk about this. But Brittany was not trying to talk to Jayna. Brittany was trying to silence Jayna, and she had lied about her wallet to lure Jayna back to the store. This was a setup. Earlier that night, during their shift together, Jayna had caught Brittany stuffing a pair of yoga pants into her bag and had confronted her about it. And it's believed Brittany was worried Jayna was going to tell their boss about it the next day and that Brittany would be fired because of it. And then once again, her life would be derailed and she would be humiliated, and Brittany just couldn't have that. And so as Jayna slowly began to back up into the hallway with her hands up, trying to calm Brittany down, Brittany began to advance on her. And as soon as she did, Jayna screamed and turned and ran down that employee hallway. She turned right and bolted down the hallway towards the break room. She grabbed the break room door and she was trying to get it open, but before she could, Brittany had caught up to her and she smashed her over the head with the pipe. Immediately, Jayna turned around, she put her hands up over her head to protect herself, and she begged Brittany not to hit her again. But Brittany wasn't listening. Brittany just wound up and smashed her across the arms with the pipe. Jayna began screaming out and pleading with her to stop, but Brittany just kept on going. And for the next several minutes, Jayna just stood at the end of this hallway in front of the break room door, just trying desperately to protect herself with her hands. But Brittany was so strong and fast, and she kept striking her on her head and on the sides and anywhere else she could land a blow. The blood spatter on the walls of the end of that right hallway would later reveal that Jayna had gradually moved from a standing position down to the fetal position, meaning Brittany had literally beat her until she collapsed on the ground. And when Jayna hit the ground, She must have known she was trapped. There was no escape route for her, and she was so badly wounded that even if there was a way to go, Brittany was going to catch up to her and Brittany was going to stop her. And so Jaina just began quietly begging for her life. But Brittany had other plans for her. At the end of that right hallway that they were both in, Brittany had noticed a red toolbox was on the ground in the corner. And so around the time Jaina had fallen to the ground and was begging for her life, Brittany dropped the metal pipe and she casually opened the toolbox, revealing screwdrivers, nails, wrenches, hammers, all sorts of tools. And one by one, Brittany began reaching into this toolbox, taking out a tool, and then smashing, cutting, slashing, and beating Jaina with it. It would take Brittany roughly 10 minutes to cycle through every single tool in that toolbox. But shockingly, despite being dealt 330 significant wounds, Jaina was still alive and she was still pleading for her life. Frustrated, Brittany stood up, she chucked the tools on the ground, she turned around and she walked down the hallway all the way to the kitchen at the other end of that left hallway. She went inside and she grabbed a large knife. Then she marched back into the hallway. She went straight down all the way to Jaina. Jaina is still begging for her life, and Brittany just reaches down. She grabs her hair with her left hand and pulls her head forward towards her. Then she takes the knife with her right hand, she raises it up, and she brings it smashing down into the back of Jaina's skull. The knife would pierce her skull, it would pierce her brain, and that would be the killing blow. Once Jaina was deceased, Brittany simply got to work, staging the store to look like a robbery gone wrong. The first thing she did was drag Jaina's body out of the hallway and into the break room. And then once the door was shut, she headed out to the front of the store and just walked straight outside and climbed into Jaina's car that was still double parked outside. And she drove that around the block to a parking lot. And then when she got back inside of the shop, she went to that bin of shoes used for fitting pants. And she took out the size 14 men's shoe, she put them on her feet, and then she began walking around in the pool of blood underneath Jaina in the right hallway and began tracking the bloody prints all over the store to make it appear like a man was involved in the attack. And then after cleaning the shoes, she ransacked the store, and then she grabbed a knife and a screwdriver and she headed into the bathroom where she repeatedly stabbed and slashed herself before tying her hands and her feet with zip ties. At 8 a.m. the next morning, she was discovered. The seemingly small piece of information that Brittany kind of accidentally gave to police during that second meeting, this piece of information that kind of broke the case, that came when the police asked her if she knew what kind of car Jaina drove or if she'd ever been inside of Jaina's car. And Brittany would say, "No, I don't know what it looks like and I've never been inside of it." But a couple of days later, when Jaina's car would be found and the police would search it, they would find Brittany's hair and DNA all over it. So they knew Brittany had been lying to them. And so this is what ultimately led to Brittany's arrest, and she would later be convicted of first-degree murder and sentenced to life in prison without parole. Thank you.